Welcome everyone to the third session of Mishnah in Depth, Bava Metzia with Dr. Rachel Furst. This course is a project of Drisha's Rifka Rosenwein Mishnah Division and is sponsored in her memory by her family. This course is following the Mishnah Yomit schedule, where we will learn independently on our own 1 to 2 mishnayot per day and come together once a week to review, look on some things more in depth, and recap together our learning. This is to anchor and support your learning on your own. And for those who have not had the pleasure of learning with Dr. Furst before, she is a scholar of Jewish law and Jewish history, who is teaching currently at Ben Gurion University and David Yellen's Teachers College in Israel, as well as Paideia Institute of Jewish Studies. She has studied at Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Columbia University, and has taught widely in Europe, Israel, and the United States. And with that, I want to hand things over to Dr. Furst.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks for the introduction, and welcome to, I think everyone that I see at least has been here in some previous week. So welcome back. And if anybody new is joining today, welcome to our 8-part series on the mishnayot of Tractate Bava Metzia. This past week, for those of you who are following the Mishnah Yomit schedule, this past week you should have picked up sort of in the middle of chapter 2 of Bava Metzia. And today you should be learning the Mishnayot 7 and 8 in the middle of chapter 3 of Bava Metzia. So this past week's Mishnayot really span those 2 chapters. However, what I'd like to do together in class today is actually to focus primarily, almost exclusively on the Mishnayot of chapter 2, because I want to use this opportunity to look at a complete chapter as a unit of Mishnayot. And the Mishnayot of chapter 3 will perhaps touch upon some of the beginning ones at the very end of class today, and we will pick up there next week. Next week, you're going to be learning, or I should say, this week, perhaps starting tomorrow, you'll be concluding the Mishnayot of chapter 3 and continuing on to the Mishnayot of chapter 4. So we'll cover those in class next week. Okay, so this week's, I'm going to share my screen with you in just a moment. But before I do, I just wanted to note that chapter 2 of Bava Metzia, which is often known as chapter Elu Metziot, these are the found objects, or these objects count as found objects. Those are the opening words of Mishnah 1 of chapter 2, which is why the chapter is often referred to as Perek Elu Metziot. This is a very classic chapter, interestingly enough, for beginning Talmud study. Many children in different classrooms in different parts of the world who are just getting their feet wet, just beginning to study Talmud, will often start with this particular chapter of Mishnayot and then Talmudic sugiyot, Talmudic discussions. It's kind of an interesting choice for first-time Talmud study. And I wanted to take a moment before we ourselves delve into these Mishnayot to think about why this might be a classic opening chapter, right? A classic first chapter of Talmud study. If you were, I don't know if some of you have perhaps engage or remember when they started Talmud study, what might you have chosen as your first chapter of Talmud study if you had the choice? What would make sense to you? How would it make sense to you to begin Talmud study? Or alternatively, do you have any thoughts as to why this particular chapter, chapter Elu Metziot, might be a traditional one for first-time Talmud students? Yeah.
I would have thought more the first of the Bava, not this one.
You would expect Bava
I would
Kama
go
to
with
be.
avocado because I think damages is a class of damages. And I know that's one of another common early Masechah.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So Bava Kama, I mean, insofar as it's the first of the three Nezikin tractates, as we've discussed, that would make sense. Yeah, Cheryl.
You say, who hasn't lost something? Everyone's going to relate to this at some level. It's part of their world.
Okay, so there is definitely something that is very, as you say, relatable about Tractate Bava Metzia, or at least this section of Tractate Bava Metzia. Everyone's had the experience of losing something at some point in time, and most of us have also had the experience of finding something at some point in time. So it's a very, as you say, relatable or very common experience. So in that respect, maybe it's a good choice of subject matter insofar as it seems like an everyday sort of common issue. Other thoughts? Anyone who disagrees? Yeah, Yasmin.
I do understand why this one would be a first one, especially for like, I'm assuming these are school children who study this.
Oftentimes school children, yeah.
Because I've had to have discussions with my students about just because you find something, it doesn't mean it's yours. We have rules about finding lost objects. It doesn't belong to you. I know you want it, but you can't keep it. So that I get that. And also from a purely technical standpoint, at least for me, the beginning of Masechet Brachot is probably easier to read and understand. So
yeah,
that's
so that's a
probably
good point. So I want to
with.
thank you. I want to pick up on the two points that you made. I think many people instinctively would choose something like brachot. Brachot is the tractate that deals with various parts of the prayer service, and of course the blessings before eating food and whatnot. I think many people would choose that as instinctively as a good opening choice, if only because when we think oftentimes of Talmud study, we think of Talmud study as being sort of a window into Jewish law and Jewish practice. And if you're instructing first-time Talmud students or young children in what halacha, what Jewish law is all about, many people would want to convey something about piety, about holiness, about something sort of inspirational about what it means to be a religious Jew altogether. And brachot would seem like a classic choice in that regard, or maybe Shabbat even, right? Some aspect of ritual law, which is common practice, would seem like a natural choice if that's the message that we want to convey to our students. Nevertheless, as we said, there are certainly school children who do start with brachot, but many start with elu mitziot. And I think it does go back to the other point that you made and the point that Cheryl made about the relatability of the subject matter. I think there's also
Excuse me.
yes,
I'm
please.
sorry, I joined late, but maybe the idea is to convey that halacha pertains to every part of life.
Right.
and no matter what it is, from the moment you get up, everything can be infused with a Jewish flavor. And there is nothing that is not commented on and regulated or thought about by the rabbis. And
I think that's
even
an excellent
something
point.
so mundane as losing something, or a donkey, having too many packages on it, has been thought about and extrapolated from something in the Torah and then discussed in the Gemara.
Yeah, I think I think all of these, just to pull it all together, I think that's an excellent additional point, which is that according to rabbinic tradition, holiness is really about elevating the mundane, right? It's about acting with integrity or about following moral imperatives in all of our dealings with other people as well as with God. And in that respect, these sort of, everyday kinds of interactions, as all of you have said, demonstrating that these two, or that these specifically, are a source of rabbinic interest, of halachic discussion, of religious meaning. That's perhaps a really important educational message that many educators would like to convey to their students right at the very beginning of their, as I said, sort of dipping their feet, getting their toes wet in study of Talmud. I would just add to all of those things that for many people, the order, the mishnayot and the gemarot of order nizikin are kinds of the meat and potatoes, kind of the bread and butter of Talmud study. They're really like, the hardcore masechtot, because even though they deal with very common everyday kinds of interactions, conceptually, they are challenging in a positive way. And whereas Elu Metziot specifically is manageable for many beginning students, it definitely fits into that category, that genre of Nizikin tractates. And so that's one of I think all of these are different reasons why it's a classic choice. Okay, that's something perhaps to think about as we continue to pursue our study of Bava Metzia more broadly. What I'd like to do, as I said, for those of you who are joining a few minutes late, this past week, you would have been, assuming that you're following the Mishnah Yomit calendar, hopefully you will have studied the mishnayot of Tractate 2, the mishnayot of Tractate Bava Metzia, chapter 2, and you will have started chapter 3 as well. But in today's class, I really want to focus on the Mishnayot of chapter 2, and I want to use this opportunity to take a step back. When we study Mishnah Yomit, it's a little bit of a misnomer, because really the schedule, that the standard schedule includes the study of 2 Mishnah portions on a daily basis. We get to dive into these individual small pieces, but sometimes when studying that way, we kind of miss the opportunity to take a step back and to look at bigger, larger units of Mishnah. And so what I'd like to do today is really to take a step back and look at chapter 2 as a unit. There have been many different ways that have traditionally been adopted for studying Mishnah, or many different ways, you might say, to appreciate, to think about the form and the function of Mishnah as a work, as a collection. One classic way of thinking about the Mishnah is as a legal code, or as maybe a textbook of law. And a lot of scholars have promoted that idea. Others argue that Mishnah is first and foremost an educational treatise, right? We think about the way that the Mishnah was organized, or the way that the Mishnah was edited. Many scholars argue that in fact it was organized according to pedagogical principles, or at least in ways that assist pedagogy, that assist the teaching and the memory, the memorization of these Mishnayot. But more recently, one of the approaches, or one of the ways of thinking about Mishnah that has been adopted and promoted, is to think about the Mishnah as a literary text. And here, when I say Mishnah, I don't mean an individual unit. I mean Mishnah as a whole, the 6 orders of the Mishnah. To think about it as a literary text. For those of you who are longtime students of this Mishnah in-depth series at Drisha, you may have had the zchut, the opportunity to learn with Rabbi Avi Wolfish, who is one of the first and foremost promoters of that way of looking at the Mishnah as a literary text. And that's really what I want to, that's the way that I want to think about it today. And again, to use chapter 2 as an opportunity to explore what the advantages of thinking about the Mishnah literarily bring to us, right? What can we learn about individual chapters of Mishnah? How can we deepen our understanding by thinking about it as a literary text? Now, if we want to think about the Mishnah as a literary text, first of all, we need to pay careful attention to language. In particular, to notice when there are repetitive words or phrases, or particularly evocative words or phrases, on the assumption that this language was chosen very precisely all the way down to the level of individual words. In addition, we're going to have to pay attention to different sections or divisions within a particular unit of Mishnah. And again, the unit we're going to be looking at is chapter 2. And then finally, taking a step back, we want to be thinking about the significance or the meaning of these literary features of the text. So if we take chapter 2 as our example, and here I'm going to have to ask you to think back to your study of those mishnayot. And by the way, I want to pause for just a moment to talk about the different editions, let's say, of Mishnah that you might be using. There are many different editions of Mishnah out there. All of them are appropriate for this kind of study. Some of you may be learning with online tools. Svarya is a really easily accessible version. Some of you may have other versions of the Mishnah that you like, or other translations of the Mishnah that you like. I wanted to just point out this particular edition. I'm going to show you in a minute. It's called Mishnah Sdura. This particular edition, oops, I'm sorry, because my screen is blurry, you might not be able to see it so well. But the Mishnah Sdura edition is a particularly useful study tool because what it provides is, it doesn't provide much in the way of commentary, but it does allow you to look at usually all of the mishnayot, or most of the mishnayot of an individual chapter, laid out on a single page. So it's a valuable tool, particularly when you want to think about the Mishnah as a literary text, because it allows you to identify different units or to hone in on these different words or phrases. If you don't have access to that particular edition, another thing that you might want to do as a way of perhaps reviewing the mishnayot that you've studied within a particular chapter is, and again, you can do this even with some of the internet editions that you might have accessible, to just look at the mishnayot without commentary. After you've studied the individual ones and understand the individual pieces, to take a look at how they line up if you were to get them onto a single screen or onto a single page, and then to start paying attention to, are there words and phrases that repeat themselves? Are there ways of subdividing this chapter into smaller sections that help us appreciate some of the larger themes that Chazal were grappling with? So again, even if you haven't done that for chapter 2, if you have a Mishnah in front of you, you can sort of flip through it. Or if you remember still the mishnayot, the various mishnayot of chapter 2, does anyone have a suggestion as to how we might subdivide chapter 2? And I'll make it even easier. If we were to divide chapter 2 into 2 sections, how might we divide it? And again, I know this requires taking a quick glance back. The first Mishnah begins, Elu Metziot Shelo ve'elu chayav lahachriz. Which found objects belong to the finder, and which of them does he or she have to announce? There are 11 mishnayot in the chapter. Any suggestions as to how we might subdivide the chapter? All right, next time I ask this kind of question, I'll give it to you as a homework assignment so that you have a little bit of forewarning and you can look at these mishnayot in in conjunction with one another. The way that I would suggest subdividing the chapter is to divide it, it's not going to be even half and half. Okay, so Nathan, I see, is suggesting that we divide it into mishnayot 1 through 5. and then 6 through 11. So Nathan, can I ask you to follow up? Why would you divide it that way? If you can just write it into the chat if that's easier for you at the moment, or anybody else who has an idea as to why we might subdivide the chapter into mishnayot 1 through 5 and then 6 through 11.
Well, Nathan, I don't want to answer for you.
Okay, so Nathan says okay, that's fair enough, right? He says mishnayot 1 through 5 were more intuitive. Once he got to 6, he had to pause and really think. So maybe there's something to that. Maybe that's a reason to divide them up in that kind of way. Any other suggestions? Someone was just, I apologize.
Another thing that goes with the break he suggested of that Nathan suggested of 1 to 5 is that 1 to 5 are rather lists. These are the ones that are yours, and these are the ones you need to announce, right? And it divides them up. 6 is kind of in between because it's talking about how long you need to do it and sort of the technicalities of announcing it, of the hachris. And then you go into some more, it just goes into finer points of rather than the list. How do you take care of it? What about if it's an inherited thing?
Okay. Yeah. So that's a good suggestion. My only issue with that, or my main issue with that suggestion is that Mishnah 5 itself, which we're going to see the text together in just a few minutes, but for those of you who have the text in front of you, Mishnah 5 itself is more of a principle, right? It says, Af hasimla hayta bichlal kol ela lama yatsa, right? And what this really is a midrash on the verses. And I'm going to make this clearer because we're going to look at that text together. But working with your theory, Eve, right? You suggested that the first section is really lists of items. Mishnah 5 doesn't quite fit into the lists, right? So that's a little bit of an outlier. But okay, that's one suggestion. Any other ideas? So I'm going to share my screen now, and I'm gonna make another suggestion. Bear with me for just 1 minute as I get my screen up here. What I'm going to suggest is that we divide the chapter into mishnayot 1 through 8, and then 9 through 11. The reason that I want to suggest that we divide it in that way is because Mishnah 1 and all the way through Mishnah 8 talks about, right, you can almost look at the beginning of Mishnah 1, Elu Metziot Shelo ve'elu chayav lehachriz, as a title for the entire section that comprises Mishnayot 1 through 8. And here I'm just going to move forward for one moment to take a look at this Mishnah, this opening Mishnah, that line, right? Elu Metziot Shelo ve'elu chayav lehachriz, which means in a case where one discovers lost items, which found items belong to him, and for which items is one obligated to proclaim his find so that the owner of the lost items can come and reclaim them, right? So, and all of the subsequent Mishnayot through 8 are talking about these mitziot, these found items. And then suddenly, when we get to Mishnah 9, right, which I want to suggest Mishnayot 9, 10, and 11 comprise the second section, all of a sudden, when we get to Mishnah 9, the Mishnah says, Ezo hi aveda. Aveda, as contrasted or as compared to Metzia. Aveda, if Metzia means a found item, Aveda means a lost item or lost property. All of a sudden, Mishnayot 9 through 11 are focusing not on the found item, but rather on the lost item. Now you could say these are two sides of the same coin, right? The the found item obviously is the lost item, right? They are, insofar as the item itself is concerned, one and the same, but it is two very distinct ways of looking at two very different perspectives on that item. If we think about it as the lost item, the Metzia, then we're thinking about that object from a different perspective than if we think about it as an Aveda, as a lost piece of property. And so that's why I want to suggest that the way that we divide this chapter is into those two sections. Let's take a look a little bit more. I want to go back to that chart that I provided, and I apologize, this chart is an entirely Hebrew chart. So if anyone has difficulty following along with the Hebrew, my apologies, and you can certainly follow along with the mishnayot in whatever translation you have them available. But sometimes when we're looking for these literary features, it's helpful to focus in on the Hebrew, on the original language. And I apologize that I did not, I will before I send out these slides, put the credit for this chart. I borrowed this chart from an article by Yitzchak Ben Pazi, who is a scholar who looked at this chapter of Mishnayot and broke it down in the way that I'm going to adopt as well. So let's take a look at how it would work. If we divide the chapter into those two sections, then what we get is, again, as I said just a moment ago, division A, which we can call Elu Metziot, which again comprises Mishnayot 1 through 8. So that's what you have here on this screen. You have Mishnayot 1 through 4, and I'm going to talk about the reason it's divided in this way, further divided in this way in just a moment. Right, this is the second part of that chart that pertains to division A. And then you get division B, which is Mishnayot 9 through 11, or Tet through Yud Aleph, which you have on the screen that you can see now. Now, just even glancing at these screens, you'll already have paid attention to the fact that we can further subdivide these two divisions, the Elu Metziot division and the Ezohi Aveda division, into subsections. So focusing in for a moment on the first section, the Elu Metziot section, as I said, the opening line of Mishnah 1, Elu Metziot Shelo ve'elu chayav la'achriz, is almost like a title for this division. But then we have subsection 1, which comprises Mishnayot Aleph, Bet, Gimel, and Daled, or Mishnayot 1 through 4, that really hones in on the question, which found items may be kept and which found items must be announced. Right, and if we want to even further divide that, Mishnayot 1 to 2 talks about identifying features of these found items that would determine whether we can keep them or whether we have to announce their finding. And Mishnayot 3 to 4 talk about an identifying location. Right, the way in which a piece of property might be identified not by a feature of the item, of the object, but rather by the location in which it was found. So just to make this a little bit clearer, sorry that I'm skipping around so much today, but let's take a look at, again, Mishnah number 1, chapter 2, number 1. Right, we said, Elu Metziot Shelo ve'elu chayav la'achriz. Elu Metziot Shelo, these found items belong to him, right? And now we're talking about, again, identifying features. So if you find scattered produce, scattered coins, bundles of grain in a public area, round cakes of pressed figs, baker's loaves, strings of fish, cuts of meat, wool fleeces that are taken from their state of origin, flax stalks, or bound strips of purple wool, these belong to him. Him is the finder. Why? Basically because the assumption is they have no distinguishing marks that would enable their owners to claim them. Right? Let's just focus in for a moment on the baker's bread. Right? Baker's bread means mass-produced bread, right? You could have bought this bread from the baker and your neighbor could have bought the exact same bread from the same baker. It looks exactly the same. There's no way to know which loaf is yours and which loaf is your neighbor's. And so therefore, these kinds of items, which have no identifying marks on them, those are finders keepers, right? Those belong to the finder. The finder does not need to make an attempt to return them to the original owner, because essentially there is no way of determining who the original owner was. Now, Rashi, by the way, on this Mishnah, explains that the logic here, the assumption, the way that we break the ownership over this object, or that we disconnect the item from the original owner from a legal perspective, is on the assumption, and we've discussed this in some of our previous classes, it's based on the assumption that the original owner, knowing full well that the item they lost has no identifying mark, immediately upon discovering that the baker's bread that they just bought fell out of their basket in the middle of the public thoroughfare, immediately upon discovering that, the original owner had what we call in halachic terminology, yeush, despair, right? Basically, it said, oh, well, there goes my loaf of bread, right? I'm never going to be able to retrieve this loaf of bread. And the moment that the original owner despaired of ever retrieving their property, that property, from a legal standpoint, became hefker, or ownerless. Once the property is ownerless, then again, finders keepers. Right, so that's the way that other commentators explain it in slightly other ways, but Rashi is a very classic way of understanding why the halacha would be as such. Now, the Mishnah goes on to say that if one finds a lost item in which there is an alteration, right? So there's something has been changed a little bit from the standard, then the finder is obligated to proclaim his find, because that already is an identifying mark. So for example, if a person finds a round cake of pressed figs with an earthenware shard inside it, or a loaf of bread with coins inside it, which is already a little bit out of the norm, then he is obligated to proclaim his find, because there's an assumption that the owner might have pressed those or made those signs or left those identifying marks on the item so that they would be able to reclaim it. In that kind of case, we can assume that the owner would not automatically despair of losing their item, and so it does not become hefker or ownerless in the same way as the unidentifiable object. Similarly, the Mishnah number 2 in the chapter talks about elu chayav lehachriz, items that one is obligated to proclaim and to attempt to return. And again, provides a list of different items that are considered identifiable. Now, as we said, Mishnayot 3 and 4 continue to talk about this distinction between identifiable objects and non-identifiable objects, but on the basis not of marks, but rather the location in which they were left. Okay, so going back to our chart now, right? We said in the first subsection of Division A is about items that can be kept and items that must be announced. And so it proceeds. Now, this division, elu mitziot, also has 2 additional subsections, and they comprise, subsection 2 pertains to mishnayot, as you can see in the chart here. We're reading the chart basically from right to left. And so subsection 2, that first row of squares here on your chart, these mishnayot all basically address the question of procedure, right? Assuming one has now found an item that one is obligated to return or to seek the owners of, what's the procedure? Right? How does one go about attempting to return these found objects? Right? And there's a question about, for example, how long does one need to continue? That's Mishnah Vav. How long does one need to continue to announce the finding of these objects? What ways does one need to, what details does one need to include in the announcements, etc. And finally, this Elu Metziot division in subsection 3, which comprises basically Mishnah Chet, Mishnah number 8 of the chapter, that hones in on the question of the responsibilities of the finder so long as this object remains in their possession, right? So for example, right, if you are holding onto an object waiting for the original owner to come and reclaim it, right? You've made the announcement, you're in the process of searching for the owners, but in the meantime, this animal that you have found is now stuck in your barn, or the books that you have found are now in your possession, or the various vessels that you might have found are in your possession. What's your level of responsibility for maintaining those items? Right now, if we're talking about animals, right, that could end up being quite expensive. You have to now take care of this animal, right? You have to pay for its maintenance, you have to pay for its food, you have to pay for its upkeep, right? That can become an expensive proposition. And even if we're talking about an inanimate object, which doesn't not going to cost you in terms of eating food, but nonetheless, if we're talking about, for example, books which can get mildewed or can get dusty, right? What is your level of responsibility for the upkeep of these items as long as you're in your possession, right? All of these are nitty-gritty details of how to deal with mitziot, with found objects. And so all of that together comprises the first section of chapter 2. Now, one thing I want to point out, we said we're going to be honing in on different words and phrases. I want to point out that in this particular division, do you notice, even just glancing at it visually, is there a particular word or phrase that jumps out at you that gets repeated often in this
Elu?
section? Say that again.
Elu?
Elu, yeah. So that's a phrase that comes up often. That comes up also to a certain extent in the second section, but yeah, that's one word. Anything else that you notice?
Matzah is leaping
Matzah,
out.
right? Mitziot, right? If on the other the mishnayot that we looked at, the individual mishnayot, I highlighted it for you. But the word mitziot and other versions you can see here in, for example, Mishnah Gimel, matzah, matzah at the beginning of Dalid, right? That's a root word that comes up, in fact, 14 different times in the course of this section. Whereas, as we said, aveda, right? The lost, looking at this object as a lost item, that's the other way of referring it, but that root actually only comes up 3 times in this section. So this section is really about mitziot. Whereas, for example, if we were to turn to this second division, division B, which again begins with the heading, Ezohi Aveda, in this particular section, if you were to go and count, you would see that the word or the root, some version of the word Aveda comes up 10 times, whereas matzah or mitzia only comes up 2 times, right? So it's very clear that one of these sections is about mitziot, whereas the other section is really focusing in on avedot. Now, taking a look at this second section of mishnayot, here too we can subdivide. Again, we're talking about only 3 mishnayot, Mishnah Tet, Yud, and Yud Aleph, but here too we could subdivide it if we were to go and really look into the details of each Mishnah. The first subsection is about when a person is exempt from returning lost property. The second section is about when a person is exempt from removing a burden. Now, here we have to take a step back for a second, right? We have been up until now talking about the mitzvah of hashavat aveda, of returning lost property. And those of you who joined us in previous weeks, we looked together at the Torah source, at the verses that underlie these mishnayot. We're going to look at them again in just a moment. One thing that I mentioned in passing, but that I want to take a look at more carefully together today, is that the Torah in both of the two places where it discusses hashavat aveda, or the obligation to return lost property, follows that mitzvah with the obligation to remove the burden from a struggling animal. And so this subdivision B that talks about ezohi aveda first asks the question of when a person is exempt from returning lost property, and then asks the question of when a person is exempt from removing a burden from an animal that they see struggling. And then finally, the chapter concludes, Mishnah number 11 addresses the question of who takes precedence in the case of returning lost property, or in the case of removing a burden. And in a quasi-related case, we'll have to ask why this is related, in the case that someone is taken captive. Just want to pause here for a moment, because we said that we were talking before about how this chapter and this tractate as a whole deals with, sort of everyday occurrences. I think to most of us, before this past year, we would not have thought of pidyon shvuim, of the obligation to redeem captives, as something that was me'inyanei diyoma. Very unfortunately, as we well know, that is true, has become a real, actual issue that we have to deal with. Now, let's take a step back, though, for just one moment, right? We said that when we're looking at units of Mishnah from a literary point of view, we want to pay attention to thematic subdivisions, which we've just done. We want to pay attention to language, which we've also highlighted, at least the beginning of which we've highlighted. Right, there are more things to be said about language, but we're not going to do that right now in this particular chapter. But we said that the next thing that we want to do, and really the goal or the purpose of looking at this text as a literary one, is to use these tools to think about some of the deeper meaning or reasons why the editors of this text might have organized the halachot in this particular manner. So let's do that right now, right? Now that we've seen, at least schematically, the way that chapter 2 could be mapped out, what do you think is the significance or the meaning of organizing the mishnayot so that we have this one section, one division that focuses on mitziot, and another division that focuses on aveda? Right, with all of the sub topics that we've briefly reviewed. What might be the significance of that? Why might the editor of the Mishnayot, of the Mishnah, have chosen to organize the halachot in this way? What might it help us see or understand about the rabbi's take on the mitzvah of hashavat aveda? Any thoughts? I'll give you just a moment to think about that. But what I want to suggest while you're thinking about that is that perhaps what Chazal are suggesting here is that there are different ways, at least two different ways, of thinking about or approaching this mitzvah of hashavat aveda, of returning lost property, which again is the overall theme of the chapter. Section 1 seems to really be focusing in on monetary concerns, right? What do we do? And I'll flip back to section 1 now, right? It's talking about which items we can keep and which items we have to try to find the owners of. It's talking about procedures for returning items, about the responsibilities of the finder. It really seems to be focusing on monetary concerns. What do we do? What are we supposed to do? What are we obligated to do with what is seemingly ownerless property? right? How, and again, how are we as the finders? How much are we obligated? To what extent are we obligated? In what ways are we obligated? But it seems to be treating this whole question of hashavat aveda as a question of, monetary issues. Somebody's out of money, somebody's found money, or the equivalent thereof, and how do we deal with that? Whereas I want to suggest that the second division, this one about ezohi aveda, is really looking at the mitzvah of hashavat aveda in a broader context as a question of the obligation to assist a fellow human being, the responsibility that each one of us bears towards their fellow. So in other words, not the question of what do we do on a nitty-gritty level with ownerless property, but a bigger and broader question of how are we being called upon to be ethical or responsible citizens? And to make this a little bit clearer, I want to suggest that these two different ways of looking at the mitzvah of hashavat aveda that are suggested in this organization of the mishnayot actually go back to the verses of the Torah itself. What do I mean by that? We already saw in previous weeks, I'm just going to, flip forward to the appropriate slide here. We already saw last week, and the week before, I believe, the verses from the Torah that serve as the basis for these mishnayot. We said that the Torah talks about the obligation to return lost property, hashavat aveda, in two primary locations, in Shmot and in Devarim. We looked in previous weeks at these two different sources, one against the other. We took note in particular of the fact that in Shmot, the Torah highlights the fact that the lost object belongs to your enemy, whereas Deuteronomy presents the lost object as belonging to your fellow. And by the way, here, this is the translation, and this is the JPS translation, which translates achicha as your fellow Israelite. I think that is the pretty standard understanding of achicha, which literally means fellow, right? So we noted that distinction between the two sources. We also noted that Exodus talks specifically about animals, whereas Deuteronomy talks about animals. And if you take a look at, again, verse number 3 in Deuteronomy, you shall do the same with that person's ass, you shall do that same with that person's garment, and so too shall you do with anything that your fellow Israelite loses and you find, right? That Deuteronomy already expands this to include not only animals, but also inanimate objects and basically anything that another person might lose. Right, so we highlighted in the past those two distinctions between the sources. One thing that I wanted to point out further that we did not see in previous weeks is the context in which these verses, this particular injunction in the Torah appears. In Exodus, you can see from the verses that I provided before and after that actually this mitzvat hashavat aveda, first of all, immediately following the obligation to take it back in verse number 4, the Torah requires that, again, if you see the ass of your enemy lying under its burden and would refrain from raising it, you must nevertheless help raise it, right? Which I mentioned just a few moments ago, right? The obligation to remove a burden from an animal. And the Mishnah goes on to say it's not only the obligation to remove the burden, but from a struggling animal, but also then to put it back on, because there is an element of tsar ba'alei chayim here, of this is one of the mitzvot that is understood to have concern for the animal welfare, but really the concern of the Torah here is for your enemy, right? The obligation to save your enemy or to help your enemy who is about to lose their animal and all of the wares that are on the animal because the animal is struggling. Despite the fact that this person might be your enemy, you're obligated to help them with, again, removing the burden and then replacing it on the animal in the appropriate way. And that is the case in Deuteronomy 22 as well. And that's verse number 4 in Deuteronomy. Again, after talking about Hashavat Avedah, the Torah talks about, again, this issue of removing the burden. But I wanted to point out in Exodus that this is embedded within a discussion of not carrying false rumors, not siding with the mighty to do wrong, not showing deference to a poor person, and also in verse number 6, not subverting the rights of poor people, right? This is within, it appears in Exodus within a larger unit that really talks about social, setting up a social system that really is concerned for other people and that protects the rights of other people. Deuteronomy is in many ways expands upon Exodus. And in fact, Deuteronomy is considered the Mishneh Torah, the section of the Torah that expands upon the earlier ones. So that's not surprising. But what I wanted to point out now is that this dual way of looking at the mitzvah of Hashavat Avedah, returning lost property, that we saw in the Mishnah, can be seen within these verses of the Torah as well. And what do I mean by that? If you had to, let me ask the question like this. If you had to, we subdivided chapter 2 into section 1 about Metziot, which we said is really focused on monetary concerns, monetary issues with regards to returning lost property, and section 2, mishnayot 9 through 11, which focuses in on, really your returning lost items as part of a broader ethical program of being responsible towards other people in your society. If you had to assign these two Torah sources to those subheadings, how would you do that? In other words, does it seem to you like Exodus is the source for section 1 of the Mishnah, division 1, or division 2?
2.
And the same with Deuteronomy. Is Deuteronomy the source for section 1 or section 2? So somebody said Exodus is the source for section 2. I didn't pay attention to who said that. Whoever did, can you explain what you mean by that?
I think a section Shmot, that's from Kedoshim. And Kedoshim is about creating a
Well, Shmot, it's actually from Parashat Mishpatim, just to correct that for a moment. It's from the Torah portion of Mishpatim.
Oh, sorry. Okay. But it's in the part that's about creating a just society there. So I would say that the second part is more in large, broad, strokes, and dealing with a just society. And you use the words nitty gritty for the first part, which I would totally agree with. So I think the nitty gritty is more in Devarim. And the larger ideas, I think, are more in the first section.
Okay, so that's one. I agree with that. I would also assign it in that particular way, and that's why I showed you that in Exodus, in Shmot, I showed you the context in which this comes up.
Right.
Deuteronomy, by the way, it also appears within the context of talking about how to set up society in the land of Israel, because that's basically all of Deuteronomy, is about how to take various Torah principles and apply them when the people of Israel come into the land of Israel and set up their society. But it's not as clearly embedded within a section that really focuses in on the ethical imperatives. The
Right,
moral
there's a
imperative.
hodgepodge of laws.
It's a hodgepodge
there.
of a lot of different things, right? It's Parashat Kitetse, which we read a couple of weeks ago. Yeah, which is a hodgepodge of many different kinds of mitzvot. So yes, I would agree with that. Also, I want to point out, as I underscored just a few moments ago, Exodus focuses in specifically on animals, whereas Deuteronomy talks about animals and inanimate objects. I also want to point out, if you look at the Hebrew, that in Shmot, it talks about the shor oivecha, the ox or chamoro, the ass of your enemy, as being to'eh. To'eh means, as translated in the English here, wandering, right? The animal has wandered away. We spoke last week about how animals are classic avedot because they can lose themselves, right? They wander off very, very easily. I want to point out that in Deuteronomy, it's phrased in a slightly different way. In Deuteronomy, it says, Lo tir'eh et shorachicha o et seyo nidachim. Right? If you see your fellow Israelites' ox or sheep gone astray, now in the English, you a little bit lose the difference between nidachim and to'eh, but nidachim bears the meaning of something that's really far more disconnected from its owner than something which has simply wandered off. Meaning, in Exodus, we're talking about an animal where, first of all, you know who the owner is, right? We're talking about an animal as a classic lost object where the animal has wandered off. It has become estranged from its owner, but you know very well who the owner is. The owner is your enemy. Deuteronomy is talking about a case where the animal is nidach. It's gotten so far astray, it's gotten so disconnected from the owner that in fact, we don't know who the owner is, right? And the Torah makes that clear by saying in verse number 2, if your fellow Israelite does not live near you, or you don't know who the owner is, nonetheless, you have to bring it home. You have to pick this object up. You can't just ignore it. And you have to keep it with you. It shall remain with you until your peer claims it, right? So that your level of responsibility extends even when you don't know who the owner is, and you really don't have a good way of finding out who the owner is, right? And if we think back again to the first division of mishnayot in the chapter, that was one of the details that the Mishnah delved into. How far does your responsibility extend, right? If you have no idea who the owner is, when are you obligated to return it? And then the Mishnah talks about identifying marks or identifying locations or taking it and keeping it in your house until somehow you can figure out, or the owner shows up after you've announced the finding of these objects, right? That derives many of those rules that we saw in section 1, right, or in division A of chapter 2. Those derive from very close readings of the verses in Deuteronomy, which again underscores the suggestion that Deborah and I wanted to make, that Deuteronomy is really the source for the first section of our chapter that goes into those that greater level of detail, and that really focuses in on the nitty-gritty, as we said. Our time is nearly over, even though there's a lot more to be said here. What I want to do by way of summarizing is take a quick look. Excuse the back and forth with these slides. I want to take a quick look at this Midrash Tanaim on the verses from Deuteronomy that we just read. The Midrash Tanaim will have opportunity in other weeks to talk a little bit more about the relationship between the Mishnah and the Midrash. But this Midrash is in fact also from the same period, roughly, also from the period of the Tanaim, roughly the same period of the Mishnah in which the Mishnah itself was composed. One of the very basic differences between the Mishnah and the Midrash is that the Midrash is very closely connected to the biblical verses. It presents itself as a commentary on the biblical verses themselves. In other words, it's teasing halacha out of the biblical verses, whereas the Mishnah, generally speaking, presents the law independent of the verses themselves, independent of the Torah source. Now, the Midrash Tanaim on Deuteronomy 22, the verses that we just saw, highlights in verse number 3, so shall you do with anything that your fellow Israelite loses. And I want to remind you that verse 3 here had highlighted as possibilities or as classic examples of lost objects, first an animal, then an inanimate object, and then this anything, kol avedat achecha. And the Midrash here says that the Midrash is basically asking itself, we know the Torah is very sparing in its words. So why does the Torah in Deuteronomy provide us with all three of these examples? And the Midrash ends up saying that anything your fellow Israelite loses, this seemingly extraneous or, just expansive phrase, is in fact particular, right? It does in fact come to teach us something that we would not have known otherwise. And what does it teach us? According to the Midrash, this phrase is meant to include his, meaning your fellow's land. So that if one saw water flowing and about to destroy his fellow's building or field, he is obligated to create a barrier before them in order to prevent them, meaning the waters, from destroying the property. Another matter, anything your fellow Israelite loses, right? Here's another way of reading that phrase, says the Midrash. This phrase is meant to include the loss of your fellow's body. In other words, to teach us that if your fellow is ill, you are obligated to heal your fellow if your fellow becomes ill. In other words, what the Midrash is doing here is taking this seemingly extra or extraneous or just sort of expansive phrase in the Torah and suggesting that in fact, the Torah is teaching us that the mitzvah of hashavat aveda does not only include actually returning items, objects, whether animate or inanimate, it also obligates you to look out for your fellow, to protect your fellow from any kind of loss. Monetary loss, for example, if their property is about to be destroyed by a natural disaster such as a flood, or we could think of many other examples, and even bodily loss. If you see your fellow is sick, if you see your fellow is in danger, one of the imperatives of this mitzvah of hashavat aveda, this is not how we would typically think of the mitzvah, but according to this midrash, one of the ethical imperatives that the Torah is teaching here is that you are obligated to save your fellow from all of these, from any kind of loss, be it monetary, be it bodily, and we could think of other examples. So it's really kind of expanding out this mitzvah to include something much broader than an object, a straying animal, a piece of bread that fell out of your basket. And going back to what we said beforehand, right, that's part of, I think, what the Mishnah is trying to convey as well. By taking a step back, by including in chapter 2, not only this nitty-gritty discussion of how and under what circumstances you need to find the owner of a lost animal or take care of that lost animal when it's in your property, to also expand out to talk even about things like pidyon shvuyim, your responsibility to redeem your fellow if they are taken captive. That, according to the Mishnah, and I think the Mishnah is taking its cue from this midrash, it's also about a severe loss that your fellow might sustain and your obligation to look out for your fellow in those kinds of circumstances, which again, I think typically we would not think as being related to hashavat aveda, but which I think the midrash and the Mishnah as well is trying to suggest is in fact an extension of that kind of moral, ethical way of thinking about the mitzvah. Okay, I'm going to conclude here since our time is up. I'd be happy to take any questions if there are. And if not, I will leave that with you as food for thought. I want to wish all of you a Shana Tova. By the time we see each other next Sunday, we will be in the new year. And I suppose I can only wish all of us, there's a famous piyut that we say on the night of Rosh Hashanah, Tichle Shana v'kileloteha, Techel Shana u'berchoteha, right? May this past challenging and difficult year with many kilelot, many curses for our people. May that conclude, and may we usher in a year which includes brachot and many more positive things.
Amen. Amen.
Amen.
I look forward to continuing our learning together next year, and hopefully to wishing all of you a positive and happy and healthy and blessed New Year. As I said, though, that's my conclusion for now. Everyone's free, but if anybody has more questions, I'm more than happy to stick around for another few minutes and to answer them.
Thank you so much.
That's such a lovely bracha, and this class will continue to meet even
Thank you.
with my team. Please keep an eye out for emails about any potential schedule changes. And with that, and if you have any questions that come up by email, you can always reach out to Drisha, and I can pass them along to Dr. Furst.
Thank you. Shana
you.
Tova.
Shana Tova.